Dad laughed with the booming violence that always made me look over my shoulder. Of course, he was not in the back seat of my car. He was not on this trip with me. I slapped my cheek and told myself I should stop at the next gas station for coffee, but even then I looked over my shoulder again, still believing I might find him there. It was the stupor that follows a long flight and a 4-hour drive on a dull Arizona highway. The confusion that arises after a string of bland hotels, too little sleep, and a month on the road. Many have experienced this disorientation when driving through a blizzard, fewer in a sandstorm. Imagine jumping on the highway exhausted, and as you cross the border into California, the steering wheel begins to tug and pull your hand. The wind is blowing hard, and the imperial sand dunes sweep across the highway, pecking your car with a sound more frenetic and violent than hail. You slow to a crawl, but the sand flies forward into the headlamps, and the driving slant of dirt coming at your windshield makes you forget who you are, where you are, when you started on this journey. You pull over. When the storm ends, you stumble out and stand beside the road. The asphalt bounces hot breath in your face. You look deeper into California and see a puddle of water in the middle of the highway. You landed on some faraway planet. You're an adult, and you know that the water is a mirage. But imagine you are a child who hasn't learned she's being fooled. I grew up here, on the Yuma Reservation in southeastern California, the ancestral lands of my paternal grandfather. His mother was Shoshone Paiute, and his wife, my grandma Esther, came from Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico. My father's clanship is Badger people at Laguna Pueblo for the keepers of the water people of the Yuma Nation. Yet for all his tribal connections, my childhood was confined to our family's southernmost reservation, the Yuma Nation. Holidays were a medley of native languages, but only my great-grandfather spoke Quetzal, the local Yuma language. I lived in the southern desert for the first 6 years of my life, and there's no doubt that I prefer the high desert of Laguna Pueblo instead. The Sonoran Desert requires too much of the body to survive. There are cloudless skies and brutal sun, the absence of moisture and shade. Temperatures rise to 120 degrees in summer, yet drop so low at night one can easily freeze. The desert's primary trait is deception. My childhood home is favored by the Fata Morgana. Long before I understood illusions, I saw castles and ships floating over the horizon. I chased turrets and sails only to see them vanish. The ideas I had about my family back then were confused by loss, Indian stereotypes, and silenced histories. I was small and invisible like all Indian kids are, a ghost child in love with mirages. We were broken girls. We twisted our ankles sailing off playground swings, toppled out of tamarisk trees, plucked yellow jacket and broken glass stingers out of our skin. We slammed our fingers in car doors, burned our feet in campfires, and then sat in the waiting room at the Yuma Indian Hospital, ice pressed to injuries. Joan broke her wrist. I broke my collarbone. Lori had a 2-inch scar down the center of her chest. Monica slipped through the handrails of a tall metal slide and landed 20 feet below. The reservation was rowdy in the 1970s. Scars were a main source of pride. Put a little whiskey in Dad's beer and he got to talking about his friends, crushed under a fast-moving train, stabbed in the chest during an alley fight, propped against a tree in a public park with a hot needle sticking out of an arm, killed overseas in a landmine explosion. Mom tried to shush Dad when he told us his stories, but he said we needed to know the truth if we were going to survive, to hear how tough the world could be. Swagger was a great way to get praise. Despondency hung over the reservation, and when tiny kids acted rebellious, adults saw hope and verve. A sassy girl was a girl who might make it, even given the dismal odds. My sisters and I did all that we could to impress. We rejected all things girly. We painted our dolls' faces with markers, tattooing their chins in the style of our female ancestors. We chopped off their hair, and when they grew grotesque, threw their heads in the trash can and danced their bodies around, calling out like barkers selling tickets to see Geronimo at the World's Fair. Come and see the amazing headless wonders. We were unruly Indian girls, not the friendly Thanksgiving type who knew how to cook and behave. Our mother said it was too late to teach us any manners. Dad always said, broken bones grow back stronger. He raised us the same way his older brother Gene raised him. A father's job was to control the pace of the world's wounding, to dole out the pain in slightly bigger doses each time so his kids wouldn't break under the pressure. This is what I think of when I think of my sisters and me. We didn't get anything for free, and we blossomed because of it. Blood flowering into bruises, skin thick and ripened in the Sonoran desert sun. The toughness we saw in our elders was rooted in pain, and for this reason, I've always considered crying men courageous. I remember an old neighbor bawling his eyes out over his dog, Rocco. You never saw a dog as spastic as Rocco. He made a play for freedom every time our neighbor opened his front door. Rocco, you shit, we'd hear him yell. The screen door would slam and the chase would begin. Rocco wouldn't heel, and our neighbor couldn't catch him. It was dodge and go for 30 minutes every time, an entertaining show that my sisters and I watched with glee. We'd scramble on top of the swamp cooler and cheered Rocco on, loving the way he sidled in and ducked away at the last second. The downside to our afternoon pleasure was the finish. The longer it took our neighbor to catch poor Rocco, the harder he would kick him once he got him leashed. You fat old bastard, we yelled. Rocco's owner lived alone. He passed us popsicles through the rip in his front screen door, but only if we'd stay with him for a while after eating. Cold and sticky and sweet. The popsicles were a treat we never had in our own refrigerator, with its week-old refried beans, lard-hardened cheese enchiladas, and Bud Light beer. When we finished, he'd come out and wash our hands with the hose. Then he'd gather us around his lawn chair, take one of us on his lap, and crack stupid jokes. We wouldn't leave because that would mean abandoning whoever he had on his lap. The rest of us gnawed nervously on the popsicle sticks until he let the unlucky one go. Next time, I ain't taking one of those popsicles, we would swear. Then his jalopy would crunch up the driveway, and we'd see him carrying sacks emblazoned with the words Del Sol Grocery to the carport door. Our mud cakes would fall to the ground. We risked plenty for those popsicles. Our parents gave us strict instructions to stay away from him. Don't go near that guy, other neighbors warned. They said the only reason he lived in Yuma was because his ex-wife died and left him her house. They said never to trust an Indian who doesn't want to go back to his own reservation. It was hard to be certain about anyone because we were always moving. We were simultaneously rooted in the land and homeless in it due to the region's history. My great-grandparents received their land in 1884, but President Roosevelt revoked the treaty 9 years after it was signed, giving the entire reservation to the Bureau of Reclamation for Farm Development. The Colorado River was healthier back then, its water strong. In June, the river rose and burst its banks. When it subsided in July, my ancestors planted their seeds along its irrigated shore. The soil was valuable, and the Bureau set aside 5 acres per tribal member before giving the rest to white farmers. After protesting, my great-grandparents earned an extra 5 acres each in 1912. But by then, the river had been dammed and the old way of planting was gone. Only 4 houses could be built on our family's 20 acres, according to federal law. 1 home every 5 acres, and by the time Dad started a family, his older siblings had already moved in. With only 1/5 of our treaty land remaining, my family lived in duplexes, apartments, and run-down stucco houses, rental properties on both sides of the river. When the rattler got Rocco, our neighbor's scream ripped the desert. I was hiding behind clothesline sheets in a game of hide and seek when I heard him yell Rocco's name. I came out of white cotton to see his shovel moving like a jackhammer as he chopped the rattler in two. He threw the shovel down and limped over to Rocco, his good leg buckled. We inched closer. Rocco was bleeding out of 2 puncture wounds, and his forehead was starting to swell. "What are you staring at?" our neighbor yelled. The rock wasn't big, and he only threw one. It struck the back of my hand, and my sisters took off running. Stunned by the pain, I lost them. The memory gets lost too at this point, but I always say I ran down to the river. I wouldn't have gone home while I was crying. I sat there throwing rocks in the water, wishing Dad would pummel our neighbor. I'd seen him knock a guy off his feet with one punch, but he was straightening his life out, and his new docility embarrassed me. Like all the kids in my family, I admired Uncle Gene. He was 6'5" and vicious as sin, the object of our uncritical hero worship. He'd stagger in with one swollen eye, my younger uncles pale and shaking beside him, because they'd been his passengers as he raced the train, crossing the tracks just in front of it. There were, of course, things I didn't understand until years later. I knew that Dad was the second oldest brother in a family of 10 kids, that Uncle Gene was 5 years his senior and the eldest of the entire herd. But what I didn't know eclipsed what I did. Uncle Gene forced Dad to fight one of his very best friends when they were 10 years old, and when the friend went down and Dad wanted to stop, Uncle Gene threatened to beat Dad to a pulp unless he kept kicking. The longer Dad kicked, the angrier he got, until the anger took over and the kicking felt good and he cracked 2 of his very best friend's ribs. Uncle Gene made his oldest daughter, Peanut, fight as well. He took her to the house of a guy he hated and forced her to fight the guy's daughter. He used to make Peanut, who was only 12 years old at the time, drive him and his friends around the reservation when they were drinking. I never saw her skinny elbows sticking out of the window as she backed down the driveway or heard her begging to stay home. I didn't know that my Uncle Gene was the last person in our immediate family to go to Phoenix Indian boarding school as a child, or that they chopped off his hair and put him in child-size handcuffs. Perhaps because my parents never finished high school, or because my grandparents were stunned by cultural trauma, I didn't know the history. After the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, Native Americans lost their sovereign status and became wards of the U.S. government. Richard Henry Pratt, leader of the Friends of the Indians and founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, sold his idea of killing the Indian to save the man to Congress and kept a catalog of before and after photos. Native kids with long hair and traditional clothing on the left, the same kids with short hair and suits on the right. I didn't understand that my father's education in a Catholic elementary school further damaged our ancestral memories, or that it ostracized my father from his Yuma peers because his mother's people at Laguna Pueblo practiced an indigenized Catholicism and Christianity was not popular on the Yuma reservation. 500 years of mainstream media, including best-selling captivity narratives, Wild West shows, and television westerns, had branded the Indian for all time, making him synonymous with wilderness and an antonym for civilization. I didn't know that this meant the more modern an Indian becomes, the more society questions whether or not he can claim to be who he is. Most importantly, I didn't know that one night when my father was 16 and doing math homework at home, trying to get to bed early because he had a big football game the next night, my Uncle Gene called from downtown Yuma and said he needed to be picked up. He'd been in a fight. My dad was sent to fetch his older brother in a family car, and a gang of Gene's friends piled in when my dad arrived at the address he'd been given. The cops chased them, and Uncle Gene placed his foot over my dad's foot on the gas pedal to try to escape, and my father lost control of the car along the All-American Canal and flipped it into the water. One of their friends failed to emerge from the canal that night. It was the first time Dad got in trouble with the law, and he got sent away. Until I started school, I didn't know Dad had gone to prison. He'd ended up in solitary confinement where he'd nearly gone mad, and when he emerged from the hole, he washed his face in the sink and looked in the mirror, realizing, finally, that he would never be able to defend his humanity or freedom by fighting for it with his fists. Unlike my older sisters, who witnessed more of my dad's madness, I was born after his crookedness was finally becoming straight, after any illusion he'd had about who he was in America's eyes had gone to die. Dad was a pragmatist by the time I came into the world, in the final throes of the long spiritual crisis many natives go through in order to build an identity they can live with in peace. If he knew the atrocities that had been committed against our people over the course of American history, he rarely spoke of them. Some family histories are so painful they require decades to unfreeze. Understanding the past for a Native American family is like sifting through the wreckage of an earthquake. Only fragments are found: leather, bone, broken pottery, indigenous knowledge in shards. Dad and Uncle Gene raged to be seen rather than to be thought of as vanished or extinct, but they didn't have the education to contextualize or communicate what they were feeling. The complexities of life for a mixed tribe Native family in the 1950s has rarely been portrayed in books, on television, or in the media, and without talking about it at home, we didn't understand our own inheritance. Absent a voice, Mary Rawlinson, Buffalo Bill, the Friends of the Indian, and the Lone Ranger spoke for us, prescribing what we needed. I mourn my community's broken bonds with the natural world and the way the Catholic Church dehumanized my ancestors by calling them heathens. I think of the false righteousness and greed that led leaders of the church to write the doctrine of discovery, a papal bull granting land rights to any Christian nation settling an empty territory. I resent that the interpreters of Terras Nullius declared 5 continents of people only almost human because of spiritual beliefs that differed from their own. Every generation is different than the last, and I've asked my own children to look at history and to speak when they remember the atrocities of the past. There were too many times in my life when I despaired of human love because we lived in a house that was silent. God's love is all that remains for a child living in a community filled with pain, which is a terrifying thought when one considers my sisters and I were taken to Catholic Mass, where those in control depicted God as an old white man. The Holy Spirit was mine, I decided early on, because I could relate to its impermanent form: a swooping white dove, a jumping tongue of fire, a wind shaping the sand dunes in the desert. Unlike Dad, who thought we had to rise to be equal, I believed Christians could come down to earth. I believed Christians should come down to earth and join the rest of us in our humble humanity. I am haunted by my family's pain. Dad is haunted by the death of his childhood friends. Grandma Esther was haunted by ghosts who waited near the canal when she went to haul water or cried near the mission at dusk. Here is the last thing you need to know to understand my childhood. Desert mirages remind us of unseen worlds. Shifting sands expose our impermanence. The very sunset holds the blood of our ancestors, and when the wind blows, we hear them mourn.